Welcome to Close Listening. I'm your host and independent musician, Zach Morgenstern, and I'm joined by my silent co-host, Ludwig von B. So I've recently set out to try and systematically listen through Rolling Stones records. The reason for this is twofold. One is that, there's this idea that the Rolling Stones are the unequivocal, iconic number 2 band of all time behind only the Beatles, yet I feel like not nearly as many of their songs are in the ethos as their rivals. But then the other reason, and what makes the Stones really different than the Beatles, is that they aren't simply a relic of the 60s. I mean, some people may accuse them of being that, but they're still around and still enthusiastic. You got Mick, Keith, and Charlie still playing, and I suppose if you count Ronnie Wood as a classic Rolling Stone, he's there too. And I was recently reading this rock history book called Uncommon People by David Hepworth. I've recommended it before. Basically, the structure is he tries to take every year from Little Richard to Kurt Cobain and try and make it about one rock star. And then another cool thing he does is every year he creates a playlist, and at the beginning of the book they're mostly playlists of 10 singles, but by the end it's mostly albums. And what surprised me is well after the 60s, he kept listing Rolling Stones albums as relevant rock albums to listen to. Maybe that's a bit of an eccentric position, I don't know, I haven't gotten there yet, but his lists include Black and Blue from 1976, Emotional Rescue from 1980, Undercover from 1983, Dirty Work from 1986, and Voodoo Lounge from 1994's Iconic. So I'll see what I think of those records when I get to them. Now, so far, I'm pretty much a Beatles over Stones guy. Of the songs I've listened to, there are some favorites amongst the Stones stuff. There's Get Off of My Cloud, there's Ruby Tuesday, She's Like a Rainbow. Under My Thumb is pretty cool musically, though the lyrics are, a bit uncomfortable if you think too much about them. Satisfaction is solid. I'm not sure what I think about the shouty voices where you can't really make out what Mick's saying. I think it sort of depends on the performance and the version, whether I like it. And then there's When Tears Go By, which is one I want to like, because I like the combination of Mick Jagger's dark voice with sensitive words. But for me, it just feels like a weaker Sunday morning coming down. I don't like that it doesn't feel very syllabic relative to the melody it's going for. I don't like the sound of that. This is the evening of our day, yay, yay, yay. Like, pick a better word than day, Mick. But anyway, as I've listened to these records, the surprise standout has been the first one. So, not Their Satanic Majesties, not December's Children, not Between the Buttons, though that has a few favorite songs on it. Haven't gotten to Let It Bleed yet. Not 12 by 5, but this one. It's just called The Rolling Stones, though I think you can get away with calling it England's newest hitmakers. That's what I'm going to call it. Now, it's worth mentioning that at the beginning of the career, the Rolling Stones weren't making albums, per se. The music industry was all about singles, so all an album really was is, you package some singles together and sell them. Going several albums into the Rolling Stones discography, they'd actually make a different album for the American and British markets, and that continued even with their breakout album Aftermath, which is sort of like the Rolling Stones' Rubber Soul rival. The hit single on the American version, Painted Black, was only ever a single in England, and Mother's Little Helper was only on the British album because it was seen as too controversial for America. It's funny now that counts as the controversial song on that album. But anyway, I've just really enjoyed the Rolling Stones doing what they did first, which was making blues and rock and roll covers. So let's talk about them. The first track on this record is Not Fade Away, which is a Buddy Holly tune. And notably, it's not the opening track of the UK record. And what a shame that is, because it's hard to imagine a band arriving on the scene with more authority than when Mick Jagger croon shouts, "I'm gonna tell you how it's gonna be." I say croon shouts because Mick Jagger has a fairly distinct voice that I think is really best served by the song choices on this album. He's not a true screamer or shouter, he's not quite Robert Plant, but he's certainly no silky Sam Cooke either. He sort of falls somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. And that makes his songs, I guess, edgy, but, not edgy for someone like me who doesn't really like sonically edgy music. With Not Fade Away, if you think back to the Buddy Holly original version of the song, I think the appeal is strictly sonic. It's not really about the words. You have that simple guitar solo, and you have the juxtaposition of Holly's hiccupy lead vocal with smooth, articulate backup singers. Doopa, doopa da, ba ba. When Buddy Holly says, "I'm gonna tell you how it's gonna be," it doesn't actually sound authoritative. It doesn't actually sound like you're going to listen to Buddy Holly. I mean, you're going to listen to Buddy Holly because you like his music. But when you hear Mr. Mick Jagger, you know, he's the boss. He's giving you the order. He's his satanic majesty. And then it's also punctuated by Brian Jones's harmonica, which is also not in the Buddy Holly original, and it's full of bent notes, and it just adds oomph to Mick Jagger's lyric. So the next song is Route 66. It's a classic song, and I don't think it's really associated with one singer. I think other than the Stones, Chuck Berry is famous for recording it, and it was unusual in his case because he wasn't someone who did so many covers. Route 66 actually ends up the opener to the UK edition of the album, and, you know, even if I don't think it matches Not Fade Away, that makes sense in its own way. It's a solid plan B, because kind of what the 60s was about was rock and roll started as American music, and it was primarily the music of supposedly individual acts. But then in the 60s, it sort of gotten taken over by British bands. And the Beatles and the Stones and the Animals and the Kinks, they're kind of this transition period of not too loud British acts that sort of openly idolize these American stars of an earlier generation. And Route 66 is literally a song about the joy of exploring America. The next song is called I Just Want to Make Love to You. And when I heard it before, I always just assumed it was a Bo Diddley cover because it's played with the Bo Diddley beat. Dump, 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 ba-dump, dump. But in fact, it's by Willie Dixon, who is this iconic session bass player. He recorded with Muddy Waters. He recorded with Chuck Berry. And, you know, the Dixon version of the song is actually really great in its own right. He has these deep, suspenseful vocals, and it's pretty much a different song. And, you know, that's why the Rolling Stones version is so great. It's sort of like the repeat punch of Not Fade Away. The vocals are delivered with Jagger's pomp and authority, but it also allows him to do a little silly voice when he says, I just want to make love to you. Next comes Honest I Do, which it's an interesting track because it's clearly supposed to be gentler than the others. It's more of a crooner's tune than a blues number. The Stones, however, you know, they don't take out the strings. They don't become Sam Cooke. They don't go acoustic or anything. They keep the instruments that they were always playing. Now, I went and listened to the original after this, and I was surprised that the Stones version is not as radically different from Jimmy Reed's original than I would have thought. But, you know, once again, Jagger's presence is really special. It gives it a distinct edge to this, you know, otherwise soft song. But when Mick Jagger says, honest I do, you get this real actor's dynamic of the bad boy trying to be the nice guy. Makes it a fun piece to listen to, good juxtaposition. The next song is called Now I've Got a Witness, and that's not to be confused with Can I Get a Witness, which is a song later on the album. So this is an instrumental jam, and I think it was basically tied to the recording of Can I Get a Witness. So it's credited as a composition of the band, and because I'm not a huge Stones guy, I discovered that there are two ways you'll see a song as a Rolling Stones original on these albums. Either it'll be credited as being written by the standard team of Jagger and Richards, or it'll be credited to Nanker Felge, which is a way of crediting the song to the whole band, as well as their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, I believe. I believe Felge comes from a former flatmate of theirs, and Nanker refers to a gross facial expression that Brian Jones would sometimes make. You Nanker. I have no idea what the facial expression was. So anyway, this song is another great example of Brian Jones bringing in his harmonica. He sort of subs for the vocals, and, you know, it's a jam song, but it's short and it's sweet. You don't have to love jams to appreciate this song in the context of a bluesy album. Next comes Little by Little, and this is another Nanker Felge song, and another basically bluesy jam. It has minimal lyrics, and they're kind of a beautiful mess. So it jumps from a man being overly distrustful of his partner to saying he has issues with the death of his mother. And I suppose there's something artistic to that gap not being filled in, to leaving you to put the pieces together. But I don't know, the song sounds a bit messy for it to be one of my favorites. Next is King Bee, and this is another memorable track. And I say this despite the fact that I don't really get the appeal of 12-bar blues, because in a way they all sound the same. But I guess the thing is, if you just listen to one at a time, you can appreciate the appeal of them in the first place. And I think 12-bar blues are at the best when they give you more than just that blues sound, and there's a little gimmick to the lyrics. So this one is sexual innuendo with bee lyrics. I'm a king bee, baby, buzzing around your hive. And while the Stones version is great, I don't think it tops the original, which was by a man named Slim Harpo, aka James Moore. And there's just something about his voice that really sounds like a buzzing bee, so it just makes the song all the better if you listen to the original. Next you get to Carol. That's a Chuck Berry cover. I mean, I think there's nothing special here. There's maybe a slightly bigger sound when the Stones do to it, due to the difference in how Charlie Watts drummed as opposed to whoever drummed on the Chuck Berry record, and a slightly different effect in the guitars. But, you know, it just sounds like an imitation of Chuck Berry. And I think that's important to have on this album if you're saluting the rock and roll and blues tradition. You know, as John Lennon said, another word for rock and roll would be Chuck Berry. So this cover has to be there. It's fun to listen to. It just doesn't do anything to supplant the original. And now, here comes the Prestige. So when I wrote this, I said this was the only original song on this album, and then I went and looked at who Nanker Felge was, and I realized, no, this is not the only original song on this album, but because this one is not a jam, it's a standalone song, there's really something special of it. This is the birth of Jagger Richards. This is the birth of the Rolling Stones, not as tribute band, but as creators. Now, this original song is called Tell Me, and it announces that it's something completely different. It opens with this 12-string guitar riff played by Keith Richards, and honestly, it sounds so different. I thought it was a more experimental instrument than a 12-string guitar, like a sitar or something. Now, it's not necessarily a great song on its own. There aren't any particular clever lyrics in it. The words are very simple, but in the context, it's just so heartfelt, so starkly different than everything else, and the musical sound is so rich. And I like that you get Keith Richards harmonizing in it. You know, Jagger's a great singer, but when you see the whole band coming together, all coming in their awkward voices to express themselves and plead and be sensitive despite this bad boy image, it has a real great effect. Next, you get a song called Can I Get a Witness, which I mentioned earlier. It's written by the Holland Dozier Holland songwriting team, the same team behind How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You. And it turns out, just like that song, it was one that was originally recorded by Marvin Gaye. It's not necessarily an interesting song on a lyrical front, but, you know, it's justified based on the Stones' interest in Americana and being the Brits who played in an American style, just because it has this gospel sound to it. It's nice that it brings the piano sound more up front compared to some of the other songs, and there is a nice scratching howl in Mick Jagger's voice. Next comes You Can Make It If You Try, which is a cover of a song previously recorded by Gene Allison. Here, compared to the other songs, Mick Jagger really takes his time with the vocal, and maybe there's not too much else interesting about the song, but this really brings out the texture in his song. You really hear that sort of halfway between the rock and roll howl and the crooner smoothness. You also get to hear Ian Stewart playing the organs a bit more in the mix of this one. And a final interesting point here is that the backup singing, which I assume is Brian Jones and Bill Wyman and possibly others, it's mundanely kind of bad. It sounds like drunk guys in a bar singing along. But it's balanced in nicely and helps the band, again, straddle that line between music stars and ordinary people, between pop and rock, between, you know, sensitive music and bad boy music. And then finally, the album concludes with a song called Walking the Dog, which is a great, fun song because it sort of brings together the blues and nursery rhyme traditions. Now, this is one, again, where you look up the original, which is by a guy named Rufus Thomas, who also did The Funky Chicken, and he also has this rich voice. It kind of sounds like a pop or disco version of Louis Armstrong. But, you know, it's a nice, fun song to conclude the album with, and it was a great choice for the Rolling Stones. So, you know, are the Rolling Stones most going to be remembered for England's newest hitmakers? I mean, no, they wrote a lot of great songs over the years. Painted Black, Ruby Tuesday, Sympathy for the Devil. So, of course, they're going to be remembered for their truly original output. But so far, I think a lot of those albums that do have original songs, they have high points and they have just sort of mundane, boring points. This album doesn't have much originality, if originality means writing down your own words and chords, but, you know, honestly, there's only so much originality in music anyway, and this one is so filled with energy. You really get to hear the personality of Mick Jagger in several different ways. This is Brian Jones at his best, and Keith Richards and Ian Stewart and Charlie Watts, and I don't have a great ear for bass, but I assume Bill Wyman. Like, there's, great contributions from everybody. It's a fun album. It's easy to listen to, and if you look into the history, you get to discover all these great other artists in the blues, rock, Americana traditions. So, check it out. England's newest hitmakers really does not deserve to fade away. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.